can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show's support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Husseiny, who is founder of Men Behind Sport and is working in the area where we can support coaches, which is quite a different narrative actually. So before we get into it, how are you, Richard? I'm delighted to have you on.
Really, really pleased to be on, and thank you so much for asking me, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I would second that. I think actually I've been looking forward to today because it's a topic I think that's been bubbling under the surface for quite a long while, because coaches, we pour so much into our job and so much into the role and so much into the identity probably that oftentimes we're quite good at masking the sort of the consequences of that to some degree when you commit so much of yourself and you oftentimes put yourself through a lot of pain in a way as being that sort of helper to the athlete. And I think when I came across your work, it gave a lot of really great sort of tangible, pick up and take type exercises, but also quite deep sort of longer term philosophies that I think importantly centre the coaches and reprioritise the coach actually to themselves.
Yeah.
So without me kind of try to explain that, because you know far more about that than I do, beyond my sort of lived experience of some of those things that hopefully I can contribute towards. Why don't we start by you kind of telling us, why did you come to create, the men behind sport sort of mission, and did you were an S&C coach yourself initially, and then you working with like GB and China and really high performance elite end of sport, and then all of a sudden you decided to change to actually supporting coaches, and high performance sports coaches included. So why did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, there was a clear turning point. So up until 2014, I was laser focused on my career as an S&C coach. And at that time, I was, grateful, like you said, to work for the organizations I did do. I was working in China at the time with their Olympic programs, but also their, not state, but their kind of the Shanghai area as well. And the turning point for me, at the end of 2014, my mum was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so I left my job and I came home and again gave her end of life care. And as sad as that is, it has been the most transformational experience of my life. And all I mean by that, on a fundamental level, or I guess a spiritual awakening. And all I mean by fundamental level is just awareness of self. It was this deep reflective process that it wasn't a choice. I could not stop questioning every facet of my life and how I was behaving and why I thought certain things. And from that reflection, it really showed me a lot of things about myself that I hadn't seen before. Low self-esteem, high anxiety, using my job to get validation, kind of to boost my self-worth, and various things along that really. And so a deep understanding of me and kind of, which was deeply challenging. And really around that time, 2015, it was clear to me then that was my time in sport was done. I didn't actually leave coaching until 2018, after the Pyeongchang Olympics, and I was let go by GB Park and Piper. Thankfully, let go. I didn't think I was going to go back into sport in any context ever again. Not for any bad reasons. I just I was done with it. I didn't see any way. I didn't see anything in there that I could contribute to or I would want to be involved with. And as I kept developing sort of myself, learning about myself as a human being, this question kept coming to me. I was considered subjectively successful in my career. I never thought that. I always felt lacking in where I thought I should be or the jobs I thought I should have been in. And so the question was, if I was subjectively successful in my career and yet felt the way I did, does anyone else feel like that? And so I began this research process, anecdotal, not peer reviewed, all off my own back, not any institution. And I began to reach out to sort of friends and colleagues and people I didn't know. The prerequisite for interviews was, will you speak to me? And it ended up turning being 160 interviews of coaches from around the world in all the top leagues, all the continents, Premier League football, Premiership rugby, NFL, NBA, blah blah blah, all these kind of all the places, all the institutes, and it just blew me away. Like, oh no, there's this thing here that I maybe I did know subconsciously, but I just didn't expect what I was going to uncover. And that what came from it was sort of some key themes, really, 7 key themes. And so I don't know if you want me to go into that now or.
Well, yeah, well, actually, let's pause for a moment there, 'cause I find it really interesting that you mentioned, there's a couple of things you mentioned there that, and I would love to dig deeper at that just as a starting point, because there's that sort of, there's an outward projection of what coaching is to people who maybe aren't in it. That is really, it's exciting. It's really, you're working across the world, you're in sport. Like all we ever really see, I think, people that live outside of that is see the glitz and the glamour of the job. They see what, as you say, that it's such a subjectively speaking, but it's such a accepted, like, to be a head coach somewhere is a success. That's a success story, and it's like, does it seem like there's a lived reality of that is very different and actually very unsuccessful in a lot of ways. It's a tipping act, it's a balancing act all the time, and I suppose you need to give a little, you need to let go of a little, and coaching does that in twofolds.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a really interesting observation, and I would also wonder, did you have any initial problems trying to, when you mentioned about that sort of awakening, trying to understand that, and trying to respond to the questions I think you'd been asking yourself for quite a while? I think a lot of coaches maybe repress that inner voice a little bit to ask these sort of true questions, or at least what has your experience been of that? Because I think for everyone that's maybe went down the path you went to and had that sort of awakening, many kind of just grin and bear it, and they try and smother that voice a little bit, and I don't think that's often advantageous.
I mean, I tried to keep going in the path that it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to leave sport. I tried to get jobs back into sport, and I did get jobs back into sport. I think the key thing here is grief, and I lost my dad at 16, and I hadn't dealt with that at all, in the sense I was emotionally naive then, and big boys don't cry. I think of the good times, and I lost a few other people throughout my life, and uh, I'd never allowed myself to feel before. And I think this is a more of a male trait, and maybe this is a male and female trait in the Western culture. And certainly what I'm starting to see as my work keeps evolving. And so coming back to grief, like what grief allows, in my experience, there's treasure in the pain. If you can allow yourself to go in there, and you can fight it all day long, but it was and so it offers this clean slate for a period of time. What I mean by clean slate, you can begin to redefine, am I happy in my life? So something I didn't mention, 2 years later, so 2015, that was, my mum died. Almost 2 years to the day, 2017, I had results back from a biopsy of my thyroid. Now, my mum died of thyroid cancer. My biopsy, no cancer, but there were nodules, and they suggested you should have half your thyroid removed. In hindsight, I would not have had that done, but I had half my thyroid removed, and so all of a sudden, going from being emotionally broken in this period of time, now I was physically broken, and so it really put me onto this journey of, well, what is health? because I was doing
Mm,
what I thought was doing the things, and it wasn't. I was not healthy at all,
mm,
which again, it put me into the space of understanding my emotional landscape,
mm,
my self-regulation. I'd never ever looked at that space at all in my life until that moment. And what I have come to realize, um, is that that is a profound place to be, and that is
mm,
also where the biggest gains in our growth can come, in my
mm.
experience.
No,
Uh,
that's so powerful, and also I'm so sorry to hear that as well, Richard. But I mean, it's such a powerful message, however, that it's sort of like a clarity, but it doesn't always seem like it's a clarity that will stick around for long if you don't take advantage of that.
right. Mm.
So I mean, I suppose my only story I can speak to of that is that 'cause I wonder if you feel that turning points like that don't always need to come out of bad situations either. Like, I mean, I have not, maybe I shouldn't say lost all ambition, but I have certainly had to redirect my ambition since having my little boy. And it's just because it just creates such a change
Yeah.
of what is actually important. And
Yeah.
it's not to suggest that your job isn't, but it's that it's part of your life and it's not your whole life. And that it really resonates with that story you just said there, just that these turning points, but do we take advantage of it? And it comes back to, do we listen to that voice that's probably been there for a long time?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it reconnects us to our human experience. The same, when my daughter was born, the same. It was just a deep clarity of understanding of what was important to me.
Hmm.
And again, we could talk about, but I think sport to me has become dehumanized. It's
Mm,
especially at the high performance end. And I used to think, even when I was studying, if I have to get to the high performance level, otherwise I'm not successful. Where that
mm,
came from, no, there must have been some external things there, but that was within me, my low self-worth, which I couldn't see at the time. I had to prove how good I was. Um, and of course, all this is clarity in hindsight. Of course, I couldn't see that at the
mm.
time. I thought I was onto something really great, and it's not. I'm not saying it's bad to work in high performance. It's wonderful, but I think what is often misunderstood, many misunderstood about their true motivations of what's
Mhm.
driving them in that direction.
Yeah, because and it is true, isn't it? Because that need for external validation, it's almost encouraged in a sense. Because I
Yeah,
think any conversation, particularly in a performance setting, is all about how you can advance your
yeah,
career, and it's often to do with status a lot of time, and it's never really. Because if you actually go back to, if you know what the crux of what people want in their jobs, like when they actually describe it, their dream job, I always think they're describing conditions. They aren't necessarily describing the status of the job itself. And it's funny that what they actually say they want doesn't always then, it's almost in juxtaposition to actually what the job is they're trying to aim for. Time with family, financial stability, or, consistency in your life and what you're wanting. These are conditions, and that doesn't lend itself again to this route, like as you say, that because one of the things I've always had in my experience of coaching, it can be very cutthroat, and therefore because it's like the Wild West. Sometimes you're needing to then portray this version of yourself that's infallible, that's unfeeling, that's dehumanized.
yeah,
And I just think that speaks a lot to it. You mentioned as well just the way sport is just continuously becoming less and less about the person. I mean, we're in a technological age. I had a conversation in a previous episode of Colin Cronin, who talked about like caring coaching. And like we actually spoke about this very fact, Richard, and it's just you reminded me of it, of like, the technology that's there now that's assisting coaches to now drive the coaching process. Like it's almost like we're interactions with players are and
yeah,
they seem second place, but this is almost a conversation that again reprioritize who we're speaking about now. This is about the coach and actually having conversations with ourselves and sitting in that space and looking after coaches as well.
yeah.
It's just very deep and meaningful.
And,
So I would like, yeah,
sorry,
sorry,
just on that, maybe we can dive into it
yeah,
later. But there's objective. Uh, you're talking about really connection rather than looking at data, like connection between people. Like there's some really powerful objective research looking at what is connection. Maybe we can dive into
mm,
it later. But just I
mm,
wanted to bring that there. So yeah, sorry.
mm. No, no, it's absolutely true. So like let's kind of talk through. Let's maybe, if it's a good place, maybe walk us through then what in your experience has been some of the challenges that you think coaches face in the job,
and maybe in the life of coaching, because it's not sometimes just a job. They kind of it's as a lifestyle as such. What has been some of the main problems that you've found they have to overcome, and if they don't, there's longer term consequence to that, perhaps.
Yeah, there's a few levels here that I'm starting to see. Let's start with the seven themes that came out from the research, and they're kind of quite really clear, and that this is not everyone, but a large amount of the people were going through experiencing one or all of these. First one was around markers of success. So unclear whether they've been successful or not, whether they've done a good job, using benchmarks often kind of defined by other people, and I guess rather than their own internal measures. This is a statement I've heard so much, paraphrased. It's, I've supported athletes to reach Olympic success or tournament success, and I've waited this emotional rush to hit, and it hasn't come. I thought this is why I do what I do. And so many, on one, which leaves people deeply confused, because on one hand, they're ticking the boxes. They've got the role. Their athletes are successful. Maybe in some cases, their salary is more than average. They're highly regarded by their peers. So they've done it, but there's something within them that's like, wait a minute, why am I not happy? Like, what's going on? So again, that skew around supporting athletes to reach Olympic success. That's not the problem. It's the motivation that's taken them to that destination. The second one is a common one: work-life balance. You know, kind of defined the idea. What came out, an idea around the working environment is defined by the figurehead, so the 24/7 mentality, or the badge of honor, or even the skewed loyalty. God, I've heard so many examples of this skewed loyalty. An example would be Premiership football in England. A coach I'd interviewed was in his job for a year. One of his colleagues had booked off a day, legitimate day, because we get holiday, 30x day, whatever days it is a year. Booked a day off to spend it with his partner because they were expecting a baby. So went to prenatal class and had a day together. Later on that day, he overheard two colleagues questioning this guy's loyalty. I don't think that's evil. I don't think it's malicious. I think people are just lost sometimes in the overimportance of their job, of sport, because sport is put on this pedestal. And again, maybe later we'll dive into, I've got a really clear, how could we evolve sport? So let's put all up on it, and which links into undefined boundaries. Kind of, I think many, certainly came up in the research, many don't know how to say no because of fear of reprisal, of not looking good enough, kind of not aware of their values, or aware of their values, but work is constantly requiring them to live out alignment with them. Another one would be emotionally unskilled. I considered myself to be there years ago. And I think you could take this out of sport and again, put this in the Western culture. And I've reached out to some psychologists and psychotherapists in my network, and I'm grateful to have in my network, and kind of just chatted to them about this, and they sort of agreed with me. The idea of repression of emotions, and needing to be a version of a man that they think they should be. We all know in a change room environment, the banter is celebrated, the aggression is encouraged before a match, especially in contact sports. But what about the rest of it? Kind of, it's there, but it has been pushed under the surface. And so, yeah, emotionally unskilled, which is kind of the idea around sucking it up in a way. Low self-worth, seeking validation, like we talked into. There's this achievement feedback loop that's come out of the research as well that I've found. The idea around low self-esteem drives a high drive to succeed, which then leads to certain kind of this ambition to self-develop through the technical lens only, not through the whole person. And that was certainly me as well. Like, people think they're developing, but it's only through such a very, very small bandwidth of who they actually are. They get success, they get peer social validation, their expectations to keep delivering it, which of course there's not linear line. And so it drives this skewed loop of the achievements, feedback loop. Identity, sixth one, kind of around feeling trapped in and terrified to think of anything outside of their current role because they're so tied to that role emotionally. And then stuck in their head, like anxiety. another statement I've heard so much along the lines of, even when I'm home with my family, I'm not a homeowner, because I'm thinking about, or another one as well, you know, like I think the Olympic sports are pretty notorious for this, kind of always thinking about the next stage of the cycle, or, you know, like Paris is long gone now, isn't it? Everyone's looking at LA. It's only a month ago, you know. and it's there's a review right now. We can talk about that as well. Like,
yeah, and isn't that just going back to your first point about some of these, like, where you've got targets set by other people, and often it's like performance benchmarks, and if you achieve them, there's like a dopamine hit for maybe about a day maximum if you're lucky, and then it's fleeting, so it changes to what's next. And that to me, I suppose, and then when you mention about, you know, with the stewed loyalty, I think that to me is where there's always going to be or at least right now anyway, I don't think there's ever going to be a harmonious relationship between an employer and the employee, or between the culture of innovation and driving stand, particularly because sport is quite is a private sector, and there's competition everywhere, and part of what drives competition is the mantra of, like, we need to be the best, and we need to outwork the next company, the next club, the next organization. So the performance benchmarks are always set one above what we think our competitors might set, because we're trying to drive excellence and so on and so forth. And then I would wonder then, that is what the coach has to aim towards. And it's and this is where I think it's difficult, and you'll know it better than me, but I think it's also difficult in these spaces to expect every coach to be able to reprioritize things to suit themselves as well, because, like, being home in time to give your kids a bath is so fulfilling, but it's not going to pay your mortgage, and it's not going to. And what I was actually quite intrigued to understand sometimes is your view on the male psyche, because there is such an ingrained provider paradox to that, where your role as the dad, in order to look after your kids, is you're almost encouraged to put therefore their needs in front of your own, and understandably so, but that then leads itself to this self-sacrifice. It leads itself to seeing, you know what, it would be selfish if I wasn't to push into my work, if I wasn't to try and meet these benchmarks that I know aren't as fulfilling, I know are fleeting, but you know, there's a constant dance between what's long-term healthy for me and what's long-term healthy for your family. That's so complicated that I don't think, and you can tell me what you think, but there isn't a, it's very difficult to have a radical response to that. So we need to sit in this space of tension. And I suppose it's how do we do that? You know, and that isn't a cookie cutter solution to that, I wouldn't imagine.
Right. So you're going down a place that I love.
And that is tough.
You highlight a really key thing there. You know, excellence. What is excellence? Why is excellence needed? Why have we got to compete? So sport, ultimately, at its core, is competition, isn't it?
Mm.
And I believe healthy competition is really important for human happiness in a way. Like, it's innate. You look at kids; they're just innately competing with each other. But it's about the fun of the competition, not about necessarily the win or losing. And that's where the play comes in, isn't it? And I think you're right in the sense of, within the system right now, it's very hard, because let's do the example you gave, because I would love to dive into this more. But I think one around what is it to be, what is success? And I think what I hear so much around the idea of assumptions, the assumption that the job doesn't allow me to see my kids at certain times. For me, and certainly what I encourage people I work with to question that. Why is that? And coming back to the idea of the figure front, do you remember the figure? If the figure front is a divorced male who works all the hours, you know what metronome your work environment is going to be set. Why does it have to be like that? Why is that person working in that way? Again, what kind of through the deeper conversations, overworking is a way to numb feeling. Overworking and I've heard that before from coaches saying that, even when I get home, I get lonely, so I keep working. And I would say, understanding where does true connection come in parenthood. It's not when you're sort of 10, 11, 12. It's the first 3 years. And that's, Gabor Mate is one reference I'll throw out there. You need to get those 3 years right of the non-verbal contact, connection. That's where the glue comes in. And if an environment is not allowing one person to see their children, is that the right environment for you?
Does it well reward you, like sport rewards, like working 24/7?
Right.
You're not going to have your manager coming up going, Richard, you're working too much. Like, it's like, great, look at the outcomes, because that helps them.
But again, just on that point, if an athlete was doing similar, we know working with athletes that rest, recovery, well-being, time with family, time with friends is really important for them to detach from to rest, detach, help their body recover, help them to have a good mindset. We know that. Why is that not the same for performance staff and coaching? You could say, certainly at the head coach level, well, there's pressure, because if they don't deliver, especially in football now, it's insane. 6 games, 10 games, have to get a result. And why is that? Well, it's money. Money sits on top of all this. Now that's the current model, the system. There's nothing we can do about that right now within the system. So I would say kind of there's some practical things that, I have a question, defining who you want to be as a dad. The provider, there is an element, like if you're a team, you and your partner and your children, like, could you become more of a team? You're both raising children. You both have a role. You're like, what does that look like? What does that look like? What is the optimal environment for you guys to be? Yeah, maybe there's a 2-year period of, okay, right, I'm gonna get my head down. I'm gonna put more into work here at the moment, because there's a pathway that you can see. But if it's season after season after season after season, I'll give you an example. One person I interviewed worked in Premiership football, and had very experienced, and got to a point where he realized, I need to put my family first, otherwise I'm going to be divorced and my kids are not going to know me. He handed his notice in. The HR came back to him and said, what are you doing? Why are you leaving? What have we done? What are you not happy about? They got into a conversation. He was honest. I need to be with my family more. I need to see my children. So they renegotiated the contract to help him be able to stay in that. And, of course, at the Premier League level, I guess not every team, but teams with significant money have the scope for more staff, which can provide more options, I suppose. If you're lower down the leagues, there's less staff available. But I would say, if this is where I guess the harder questions on oneself needs to be asked, is this the environment for me and my family?
Because isn't that question going to be really helpful? Like pitching that sort of question, I need more time with my family, to an employer, see, regardless of what answer you get back, like that's still going to be quite a productive conversation, because if it's yes, absolutely, we'll support that, you probably know you're in the right environment longer term in a way that's sustainable. If they don't, or there's an iffy aspect to it, then that's quite a vivid picture then painted as to really who's at the centre of their care needs, so I could just see these as being quite important, and I really take that point as well. You discuss like how we can work within our own social networks to kind of map out what our boundaries are. So if it's an episodic thing where maybe the next 6 months is really hard, there's a lot of things coming up, but there's a longer term reward to it, then that might be okay. We can work together on that. But where it's this is going to be our life now, then that conversation needs to be had as well, to decide what are we willing to put up with.
Just the last thing, that's the one thing that stood out. The coaches that I've spoken to are happiest within the challenges of sport are a team with their partner. Their decisions are made together, so it's a joint decision. And I think that's a really key thing to highlight. Like, you've got to be both on the same and be open to challenge from both of them.
And I really like, I mean, you mentioned about how we treat overtraining in athletes, and then you kind of compare that to overtraining in a coach, like, and like it's a very good case example, like the Premier League, like top managers, and I always would even whittle it down, like academy coaches in football work massively hard as well because they have that promise, that sort of fabled promise of they may be that next Premier League manager, so they have that as well. But every game, that's like that isn't just the coach standing at the side of the park. That's the coach heart pounding in his chest and her chest as well. That's these worries, these emotions, the blood pressure. I'd love to see the physiological impact of actually being in these pressure situations across 90 minutes. And then you times that 3 times a week and all the other sort of impression management, all the energy that has to be put into looking the part to people, having the right thing to say. That is such a like that is not easy. Like that is massively tough. And if you continuously put someone in that space, how can you really expect them to continue to perform outside? They can continue to show up and they might develop some sort of strange fence to how they can blot things out. But numbing doesn't sound like a very
No.
helpful strategy longer term in spaces like that.
And there's what was I trying to say? That type of lifestyle is significantly linked to chronic disease. You know, the mind-body connection, living in a soup of constant chronic stress is signaling all these different genes within the body. The field of study is called psychoneuroimmunology, and the idea around chronic disease, which includes cancer, which includes fibromyalgia, which goes autoimmune conditions, that is from chronic emotional dysregulation.
Yeah, and
So
there's and that must show up as well, isn't it, in the sort of just the lifestyle itself. So you go to training sessions, and I see as well. Sometimes I don't have time to then eat properly.
right,
Probably don't have time to exercise. Probably don't have time to do the things, and then you convince yourself that it's still worth it, and because
right.
there's another reason for why you're doing it that's different to other people, and you're different from general health recommendations, and it's like there's that Superman, complex sometimes, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah. And it's all an idea. It's all a belief. And what is a
Mm,
belief? A belief is a set of thoughts repeatedly thought and the emotion felt with that. So a belief is simply a way of something that we accept, believe, and surrender to without questioning. But if the challenge and the hard work is to look inwards, and this is sort of why my work is focused on it, is to begin to look at some belief systems.
mm,
Or does that serve me anymore? You know, even the idea of rites of passage of a career in sport, the intern, the university level, training, get your undergrad, your masters, whatever. You get your first job, you hold on to it, you do all you can, you say yes, 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 yes. You create this environment that becomes a perceived normal. You then get maybe some recognition, you get some success, you get some experience, you become to get recognized, I suppose. And then kind of like you said, like, well, then all of a sudden life happens outside of sport. Maybe you meet
mm,
someone, maybe you get married, maybe there's a child involved, whatever it is, maybe there's an illness.
mm.
And it forces you to respond. And I think that's where many, can you affect beforehand? Yes, you can, but I think pain is a great teacher, and
Mm,
certainly what I hear about and people I come across, it gets to a point where I have to do something about this right now.
mm. And do we need to just, we're always almost trying to convince people in performance sport to care about health and well-being, but I don't think there needs to be a separation of health and well-being and performance. They shouldn't one lend to the other as well? Like, what's your experience been in that?
I mean, this is the crux of it. Like, health and well-being is a nice thing, but people, I would say, not maybe not everyone, but I would say there's a large number of people with the financial interest who don't care about that. Because why not? Because there's 200-300 people who'd step into that role immediately.
Yeah, so expendable.
Secondly, okay, well, how do you link that to impact? And impact, like, there's a paper recently looking at the increases in hamstring injuries when a change of manager happens in elite football. Now, not just the head manager, the head coach, but the support staff that come with that person or not. Why?
Mm,
Because there's this dysregulation there's this self-preservation of staff because of fear of losing a job. So the new person wants to come in and stamp their kind of like, oh, look how good I am. The people who are remaining want to also kind of protect their job. And so this environment of trying to be right versus effective. And there's often such a large change in intervention, which ultimately affects the athlete, which is causing increases, spikes in hamstring injuries in elite football. That's just one paper and one example. That's the human dynamic. Power dynamics is operating in so many environments that is leaving so many environments suboptimal to what truly could be possible of a group of human beings coming together. You know, innovation, collaboration. They're such cliche words, but I would say, in my experience, just my lens, that I would say many environments are deeply far away from truly embodying that, because of the human stuff is getting in the way that we don't look at.
Yeah, because I would wonder, like, because when you mentioned that about where there's a better way of doing it, but the coach feels they have to do it their own way, and sometimes that happens with maybe, have they just been new into the job, or is there are they in a space where they feel they need to prove themselves to other people, and in that space, that's where it is about winning arguments and not doing the correct thing, and I think that, because I'll be honest, like I think in coaching in these spaces, vulnerability is praised sometimes only superficially,
Yes.
only because it's popular to say be vulnerable. It's popular to say that you support mental health, but where it actually gets to the point where you're actually, as a coach who's charged with leading a team, and you say, do you know what, I'm struggling. Like, are we actually saying that, people that have vested interest in that team doing well, that have got money behind it, that they actually are in a space? And the thing is, it's something that can so easily be explained away, because, and I think, and this is where there's a messiness, isn't there? Because for every bad manager, there's also a person behind that manager too. So this is what I just would like to get your thoughts on this, because I mean, during my PhD research, I remember where I looked at influences on behaviour, there was always about the individual, but you couldn't separate the individual from a collection of other individuals who have their own influences and their own pressures. So I would always look at, like, who's that chairman, or who's that head of academy, and what are their pressures, because everyone's got their own stuff. And that's where, because what resonated when you spoke initially about that steward loyalty point, Richard, that story, I've heard it so many times, that type of story. And it's like, I always think about, there's normally something happening with aim, but the other people who are talking about that coach that missed that session, that they're also got their own pressures and things, and it makes us lose our, that, I don't know if humanity is the right word, but it makes us lose that connection with others and that empathy for others, and that's why it's difficult to, like, how do you that's a very difficult thing to become unstuck by, and that's where often I struggle sometimes with how we can change culture, because culture is a word, it's just a word, but like, we're so wrapped up in our individual lives that it's how do we get past that? I don't know if it's a helping culture we need, and it's not, because in too altruistic just becomes unrealistic sometimes, and this is where I just wonder how can we help organizations change things in a way that's meaningful but does still serve everyone, because we are innately self-serving. That's the human dynamic.
So I'm gonna, if you're happy to me, there is an idea that I do have that I haven't spoken about too much, but I'll come on to it in a minute. I want to come back to just what you're saying first around the idea around the human stuff. And, on one hand, I hear what you're saying around, if there's pressures, if someone puts their hand and say, look, I'm struggling mentally, I understand there will be challenges there financially, but on the other hand, you could look at it again just through the idea of, well, if there's an environment where most people have got anxiety, most people are needing to justify their role, why would they do that? Well, if they lose their job, then their basic needs are under threat: house, food, that kind of stuff, provider type of stuff, right? So you understand why people have this fear, anxiety. Okay, so if people are sitting around in a stew of anxiety, is that the optimal state to come up with innovation? No, it's not. What about the vulnerability? You talk about vulnerability. To me, vulnerability and being truthful to who we are take deep courage. Why? And for example, this hierarchical system, on one hand, sometimes there needs to be a decision maker. financial decisions because there's facts around what is available, what isn't. But how often are meetings in department departments or medical departments, how often are they led by the intern? Or, and what I mean by that might sound stupid, but how often is an environment allowed for the naive expert to give their opinion? And what I mean by naive expert, if someone's working within an environment, there's an assumption here that they're there because they've got to show promise, they've got talent, they've got the prerequisites, haven't they, to the technical requisites to be in that environment. Otherwise, why are they there? The benefit of a naive expert, they're not clouded by the culture just yet. They've just come in. What about the ridiculous idea? Is there space to have a ridiculous idea? Or are we protecting it because we don't want to look stupid because we're protecting our job? Again, like, you can ground this in more than they're deeply tied, but I think what's needed is come away from the lens of mental health and more around impact, because I think that's an easier sell to the CEOs. But they're entwined. They're not separate. They're deeply entwined.
Totally.
And so, yeah, like,
and is that so? See what you're saying there is, I totally agree, Richard. But it's making me think about, because it's almost like this principle of rested innovation, because like you compared that, does that sort of speaking against a more, I don't know if it's a stretch to say it's a more capitalistic agenda where, like, because profit, there's a demand and we need to plug that demand. So therefore, like, competition and to be innovative is to be non-stop, and it's to satisfy that, being able to react to that demand and be in front of the market and stuff like that. And therefore that has the connotations of non-stop. It has the connotations of you're with us and you're on board or you're not, and you can't stop because we don't have time to. But I always look at, so I mean, I come from I have quite a privileged position in that I'm not reliant on the sports sector anymore. I am in some degree, but the reason I say this is I think a good way of proving that point correct, and that I think that the idea that people need to be on edge to be innovative, I don't think it actually helps. Now I'm in a space where I take part in coaching, but my livelihood isn't dependent on it in the same way that I know many coaches it is. Now I'm able to sit and think because I have the stability of my day job, that I'm able to sit and be encouraged to think differently and to have the space and the time and the safety to think differently and to try different things. Now, I am massively more creative than what I would have been, certainly when I was still kind of making my way up to be in a more academic setting, because you don't have time and you don't have the capacity to be in that way. And it does speak to that idea that you don't need to be on edge in order to get the most out of yourself. Right. It might be the reverse. I think there is an element of that. It can help, but there's a dosage issue, isn't it? Or you can overdose on that.
Definitely. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No. That was just how I would kind of end on that. I think it is really, really helpful to kind of push back against that and be honest about that.
Yeah. I mean, you look at creativity. You could say creativity is a state of being. Someone needs to be in a state of being to be creative or innovative. So what's a state of being? Well, you can look at that neurophysiologically. So very often think, and this is where I used to be, I have to think my way to a solution. So I'm using my brain, because obviously the brain is the main thing, but it turns out the brain is just 1/3 of the decision maker. So we have a gut. So our gut, there's loads of, I guess, the last 20 years, loads of research and science looking at how the gut contributes to our mental state. So 90% of serotonin is produced in our gut lining. Our heart, and this is to me the most profound place. Our heart is a two-way communication to our brain. It has 40,000 neurons in it. I'd steer you towards Heart Math Institute, who studied the heart-brain connection for 30 years. So when we feel anxious, for example, our heart gives off an electromagnetic wave, measurable, objectively measurable, outside of our body. So that wave becomes incoherent. So it's unpredictable, slower heart rate, lower heart rate variability. We all know these measures because we're looking at athletes. Okay, so if an anxious state, lower heart variability, more of a stressed state. Okay, so when we feel emotions of gratitude or joy, that wave becomes coherent, meaning that it's more predictable. meaning that there's higher heart rate variability. And when the heart comes into a coherent state, signal, it entrains the brain waves with it. So in an anxious state, our thinking, that thinking loop over and over and over again, we're in a beta range, high beta, so very agitated brain.
Mm-hmm.
When we come into a more creative state, brainwaves go into slow down, go into alpha, theta. Okay, so that's a neurological. So if we could get into heart-brain coherence, that then is the most optimal for problem solving. So one really interesting piece of research by the Assade Business School and a company called Advanced Brain Monitoring, who's led by Chris Burker. They looked at emergent leadership. So can they predict emergent leadership by neurophysiological markers alone? So they looked at QEEG and heart rate variability. So 35 students. And they looked at, so not only, they found that emergent leaders not only regulated their own system, but they influenced the group they were surrounding, non-verbal. That led to more creative and ethical solutions judged by the faculty. The Assade Business School is one of the top business schools in the world. And it was a reliable indicator predicting leadership later in their careers. There's a second one as well, last piece of research I mentioned, by Chris Burker, looked at submariners, 100 submariners, so people who are in submarines in the military. They looked at team cohesion. And so they looked at biometrics, so skin temperature, heart rate variability, and I think QEG again. And so within 3 days, they could pinpoint the weak links within the 100 mariners, which gave them 2 options. So they knew who was going to bond and who was not going to bond based on biometrics alone, which then gives them 2 options in the sense of, okay, one, they can intervene in an intervention, or they can swap them out. So both 2 pieces of research, profound research, I think it is, when you look into it. Okay, so what we are emanating from us and how our emotional neurophysiological state is affecting our decision making and how well we bond with other teams. So going back to what we spoke about, our anxiety, if a performance department is riddled with people who are anxious for various different reasons because of their own stuff, we become more self-focused because we need to protect ourselves. And 2, we're emanating this resonant field around us, which is just driving the same kind of state, this incoherent state. And it's just not looked at all.
That word coherence, I mean, that's fascinating insights. I mean, that word coherence is so powerful because it's that mind-body connection, but even outside of that, the mind-body person-to-person connection, and you're seeing that. I mean, and I know, and some of the work that I've done, you know, some of the stuff that I'm doing in terms of developing other coaches is sometimes helping them realise, if you want, like, kids, for example, to be able to concentrate, if you aren't working on suppressing their anxiety, not suppressing, that's not the right word, helping them manage their anxiety, they actually can't focus on what you have to say either. And then also they go into a state of threat where other people in their environment, they're not going to interact socially in a space there that's helpful either. So all these things that comes back to what a coach wants, that's going to be, you know, we need to focus first on helping the person be in the best state to perform. Now let's then scale that up to the coach needs to be in the best state to perform. So maybe that's a nice way for us to start to think about what are some. But actually, there is one point I want to talk about, some wider things here about grounding ourselves, because before we go on to maybe talk about, if you will, about your sort of coach's toolkit and some of the stuff that I think was really interesting about how we could pick up some your strategies and take and use them. There was also the comment you made about just about how we enter this like kind of rat race, and how we sometimes convince ourselves of the need to be what other people want us to be and stuff like that, and or convince ourselves that there's sometimes a justified reason for doing something that's linked often to sort of materialism and, you know, these aspects. I see almost like a space there for, if it's not a spiritual awakening, because I don't think it needs to be even in that, not in the sense that people think about religion and stuff like that, but that can be one space. But I think even people getting away from this need to own and this need to possess further things, I think that there's so many tie-ins with, and I don't know if it's a Western culture or if it's identified more in Eastern culture. I don't know in terms of where that comes from, but I always feel like if you have value structures, and a lot of people don't have value structures, like they have things and it's fragmented and there's things they would say, But I mean, having value structures helps you recognize the up from the down. So there's a way of, and how can you really aim up in life if you aren't understanding the consequence of acting in an opposite way? And where we kind of, how we sort out our priorities, if we don't have a conversation about possession in that and what that means and how that really does satisfy you and sustain you, we can be more likely, I think, to be coaxed into these sort of stories we tell ourselves, or these stories that others convince ourselves of, that we need to fulfill expectations that do, at the crux of it, come down to materialism again, and coaching's a materialistic vocation. So I just wonder, what's your experience been with some of that? Because I think that's part of the human condition as well. It's mental, it's psychological, but there's a space sometimes for the spirituality of things for a coach and how that might help them.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think where we're going is incorporating the spiritual element to what it is to be a human, and I think you can ground that in values. Like what are some spiritual values? You could say integrity, you could say connection, you could say compassion, you could say love, you could say integrity. I said authenticity. And I think there is a real example in sport where this already exists. And I want to take a step back, I suppose, before I go into this. And like you said, spiritual is an individual path. We'll come to that and we'll make judgments on it in our own time, in our own way. And I think that has to stay like that. I think that there are the criticisms of religion could be there's a speaker or a leader who says what is and it isn't. I think spirituality, and religion, when it's done well, is around allowing people to gain their own experience of a deeper understanding of connection. And so we talked about capitalism or consumerism, haven't we? And I think sport, as it currently stands, what's the higher order of sport? What is the higher order of sport? I guess I'll give you a personal example of, not related to sport, but I'll link it back to sport. I went to a festival in August with my wife and daughter called the Medicine Festival. 7,000 people, and it's a medicine festival because it's healing on a physical, emotional, and spiritual level. So individually, collectively. Why would we bother doing that? Because the world is in a sketchy place right now on multiple different avenues. They had scientists, they had spiritual philosophers, they had musicians, they had creatives, they had indigenous cultures there, a group called the Wisdom Keepers. So this melting pot of ideas and discussions and practices and events aimed at the higher order purpose of reconnecting to nature. There was this musician there, did an amazing set the Saturday night. The Sunday was what stood out to me most. All of a sudden, it wasn't about him. He made 300 people who didn't know each other turn into this musical instrument. So one person created this coherence among 300 people. How does that relate to sport? Sport, as it stands right now, the system, the higher order purpose is financial gain. If you look right now, the Olympics, UK sport, for example, are going through a review right now. Okay, the sports that hit their targets, here's your funding. The sports that miss their targets, funding gets taken away. Well, when you look at the Olympics, the original festival, the Olympics, was a religious festival aimed at the celebrating the Greek gods and goddesses. When you look at the Olympics now, the values are three values are excellence, respect, friendship. When you dive in a little bit deeper, you look at the principles. One of the principles is humanism, which is a definition that could be looking at the logical, the celebration of a logical, rationalist outlook or system of thought, attaching prime importance to human rather than sacredness. Okay, right. You can handle that for a minute. And then what does the Olympics offer? Well, there's a legacy. So you look at London 2012, for example, which was a massive failure. Regards what was promised to what was actually delivered. You look at the profits of the International Olympic Committee. Up until the Tokyo Games, anyone was 7.6 billion. Anyone who works in Olympic sport knows that athletes don't see any of that. And then you think Coca-Cola. How can Coca-Cola be a major sponsor of the Olympic Games, which values is excellence of performance? Right? Things don't correlate. And so, okay, there's a dismissal or a separateness from the nature. Now, what if my last job in sport was with British Ski and Snowboard, so action sport community. What that taught me was something really quite profound. I think they want to win, deeply want to win the X Games, the Olympics. Like they're pushing the boundaries, but what sits above winning is community. They're tied deep community between competitors and nations. Why? Because people die doing what they do. And so there's an understanding of a connection to mortality. And also, if there's no snow on the mountains, they can't play. So there's a connection to nature, and that interconnectedness between what's happening in the world and how they can play in their environment. And so how can sport, I think the last thing, like sport is an ultimate, I don't know if you heard of James Carsey's book, Finite versus Infinite Games.
Not read it, Richard. I've heard of it, yeah.
It's worth checking out. So, I mean, sport is the ultimate finite game because it's win-lose. What if you could redefine it where the game keeps playing? So, for example, I don't know, you could redefine, like, what's stopping us redefining rules of a sport? The idea of coming together, again, I love the Olympics, but you're watching Paris 2024, and then, but what's happening in Russia and Ukraine? What's happening in Israel? What's happening in, and why could you not use sport as a way it was used on Christmas Day in the First World War, where, okay, it's a global event where the world stops. It's a point of reflection. It's a point of discussion. It's a point of, I link it to the film Arrival. I don't know if you've seen that. Alien ships come down and they're around the world, and kind of it's, the games are held all around the world at the same time, different venues. And last film I'd link it to is Jerry Maguire. Jerry Maguire, he had this epiphany, didn't he? And he said it's not about more clients, it's about less clients. And so anyway, he ends up getting fired, and he gets one client, and he goes on this journey. At the end of the film, Cuba Gooding Jr. nails it. He gets offered his contract, and they have this genuine embrace as friends as well as colleagues. And this other guy who's standing with the shark agent looks over and goes, wait a minute, I want some of that. And which draws me to the quote that's gone around in my head for years by Buckminster Fuller. And it's this: you'll never create change by changing the existing reality. To create change, you have to create a new model to make the old one obsolete. Now, I've got no idea how to input this into the world, but it resonates with me so much, of redefining sport in a way that connects to that spiritual element.
So would this be almost like kind of life through sport rather than life of sport almost? I don't know if it's just, I mean, sometimes often it can lead people to sport and certainly towards coaching. There's a love-hate relationship with coaching because coaching stretches you. I think if you ask most coaches what they find fulfilling in coaching, and fulfilling, like, let's take beyond the materialistic aspect, it's the overcoming themselves, and it's something I've started to care more about and actually start to use it as an anchor point in my head. I mean, there's a German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, that talks about this concept of self-overcoming and about how we can continuously try to look at what our own limitations are and continue to push on them, and that's seen as a way of living a fulfilling life. It's about continuously overcoming the self, and that's an internal driver, and it has values that stick with the person. And I think that if we consider that, then that's where you say, like, if we're seeing so much hypocrisy and so much sort of personal interpretations of what the values of sport are meant to be by big companies, and don't serve them, serve yourself, let sport serve you. And I suppose that's to arm people with having that bravery in times to maybe decide what they are willing to put up, what they aren't. So it's great. I mean, we could talk all day about this. I think it's really interesting. I want to now think about, right, we know that we need to change longer term, but I think there is also we need to also consider what helps us today. So I know that there's, and I don't say that as a plaster solution. I don't think it is that. I think it's like you can't make longer term change unless you start today. And I think that often is a reset point for people as well. So when I was looking, Richard, at you have like a free resource called the Coach's Toolkit, and it seems to be quite situation based. Like, it's like what you'll be able to tell me, it's like pre-session, pre-meetings, those sort. And I want to see, could you maybe talk us through what are some pick up news strategies? Some of them mental skill strategies, some of them might be wider strategies that coaches can use to help themselves as performers. Because again, we're now repositioning the coach as a performer. We understand that the coach needs to get themselves right in order to help others to be more efficacious, to live more fulfillingly perhaps as well. But what can we do to help the coach today?
So the coach toolbox, at the moment there are 4 practices in, and it's the start of the day, it's pre-session, pre-meeting, and the end of the day to detach from work. And it's really around that idea of state that we touched on earlier. Like, who do you want to show up as for your day? Who do you want to be? How do you want to be as a coach, as a colleague, as a partner, as a parent? And we look at beliefs and look at we have 60 to 70,000 thoughts every single day, and of those thoughts, 90% are the same as the day before. So they form the repeated thinking and feeling the same emotions. And emotion is simply a chemical residue of a past experience. And so obviously the higher the experience, the higher the quotient of emotion, the bigger the memory, the long-term memory. And so, okay, if we understand that, so simply we're not our thoughts then, and thoughts are neurological, and is it Donald, I forget his name, Donald Hett, neurons that fire together, wire together. So if we can begin to think the thoughts that we do want to do and feel the emotions we do want to feel during the day, 1, we show up as our best self in that moment. 2, we can be authentic and vulnerable because we're not self-preserving anymore. 3, we can we can kind of gain more trust and connection with the people we're working with because we're emanating this different frequency from us. Pre-session is a short one, pre-meeting is a short, and again, kind of putting it on the table, like, how am I feeling right now? Checking in, okay, right, I know I've got some judgments with that person. Okay, can I soften that? What is underneath judgment or anger? Well, underneath anger is there's some form of hurt or not been heard or feel frightened or whatever it is. There's a deeper thing underneath that. And so can we begin to understand that? Can we begin to sort of recognize where we are? Can we soften all of that and come into the state that we do want to be in that session for that person, for that athlete, for the department that we're in? And then the end of the day, to be able to detach, like to let work go, let it go. Like, we're not a 24/7, we're not a medical professional in the sense of saving lives. We work in sport. Why does it have to be at home as well? And so making that conscious effort to detach, to recognize how we feel, to detach from the things we haven't done yet, and just to be present with our partner and our children. Maybe you have to do an hour later on, but when you step through the door, you can be who you want to be as a partner, as a parent.
And is that so? Let's think firstly about that drive to the training session. So this is something that, again, and it's something that I think that's helped me, if not necessarily get better as a coach. I think self-awareness certainly did, and that came from just a continual process of reflection and trying to actually. You were talking about how we order things, try and position that as being as important, if not more important, than your content and understanding what you've got to to give to players. But I always, and when you do a lot of research on understanding influences of behaviour, you start to see as much as yourself in people and your research participants as you do them themselves and their own issues. And I think something that always stuck with me would be small things that are as simple as the time that you're giving yourself to arrive to a training session. Now, I know that the impact that can have on me when I'm flustered, the impact that has on me in my interactions with other people. So, like, it isn't just something as easy as saying, "I just make sure you're on time because it's good to be on time." It's like, eat early because it's critical to be in a space where you're able to be relaxed and you're able to think correctly. And I don't think it gets any easier, Richard, either. Like, I'm someone that, being a lecturer and also being a kind of coach developer and being a coach for a long time, I stand up in front of people and I can speak quite confidently. but I still get anxiety every time that I approach these situations. I don't think you can't remove just your emotions, or being human. You can't remove emotions. It's how you manage them better. And I know that I've had to become better, and it's helped me to think about like breath work, to think about just reassuring, affirming thoughts on the drive to training. You're a good coach, actually visualizing things going right. Also visualize things not going right and you actually responding correctly as well. Like there's self-coaching that has to be had there that I think is really, really powerful. And I don't know if enough coaches do it because they don't see themselves as that performer. Or maybe they haven't had an insight into the value of doing it, so they haven't given it a go. That's the first thing just my reaction to that. I think that is so important. It helps
Yeah.
massively.
And like you said, the state, what's fear? Well, fear is anxiety plus uncertainty. Uncertainty is all of life. We have to get comfortable with a certain level of uncomfortable. So anxiety is the lowest hanging fruit. It's neurophysiological. And you said about emotions. In fact, like coming to heart coherence requires us to feel elevated emotions. What I used to be, I've come to realize and learn, and the research in this space is incredible. Like we can cultivate elevated emotions of how we do want to feel. We can break those circuits of how we're used to feeling and create new states of being. Is that easy? No, but it's a practice, and it's a practice of connecting to our breath, breathing slower and deeper than we normally do, connecting to our body, and making the conscious effort to begin to feel emotions that we do want to feel: joy, gratitude, whatever it is, appreciation. If you begin to do that, not only do you feel better, the physiological benefits of that are profound. So an example, one paper by Dr. Joe Dispenza looked at an intervention. So 10 minutes, 3 times a day for 4 days of the conscious attempt and connection to elevated emotions led to an increase of 49.5% of IgA function. So an IgA is a blood marker of immune function. So a massive boost in immunity by feeling consistent elevated emotions throughout the day. And so this is not about repression. It's about recognizing how we feel. So tuning into how we feel. Because I think, again, where I used to be very explosive anger years and years ago. And I think part of that, it's complex, but I think part of that was I only got to experience the emotion at its peak. Research by Jill Bolt Taylor, sort of the idea of a 90-second lifespan of an emotion. So there's this, how I experience it, there's the start of it, it builds up, crescendo, back down like a bell curve. If we're not aware of what's going on in our body, and the interoceptive level it's called, we're only going to be aware of it at the peak, and then we're just going to react. But the more you tune in to breathing, how your state is within you, you can begin to sense this. So it's about feeling it and choosing to behave in a different way. So yeah, that's really.
And is that about grasping it early on? Because it sounds like when you're saying like there's levels of build up and emotions that are going to get you close to that point where it's difficult to return from them, and it's far easier to redirect an angry emotion at level 1 than it is level 9. Is that because that is, I mean, that is so. I mean, I think of it quite literally. Like, I made I don't know why I did, but I made the decision to try and start jiu-jitsu, and I'm not very good at it. And what I noticed is if I'm in like some sort of submission hold, and thought that I've been trying to teach myself is, before you get to the point where somebody's got their hand around your neck, there's 2 or 5 steps before that if you become better at identifying that, you can start to counter it. And I know it's just an expression, but there's an emotional like transference to that as well. Like if you can spot unhelpful emotions earlier on, and that comes from, I suppose, having these check-ins and having that as a routine, a pre-performance routine, let's not even use that language, then that's going to help you redirect that in a way that's useful. I think not to quell the emotions, but because even an angry emotion is useful if it's directed in a proper way, and then you can back up other things. But I like that. I think I like that idea of getting at things when they're early on, and you can't identify that if you're not conscious.
I mean, I think jiu-jitsu is a perfect example of emotional regulation, because if you lose it, you're going to lose quicker. And same as boxing,
Mm-hmm.
if you lose it, you're going to get taken out by someone who's skilled at boxing. It's not about aggression; it's controlling emotion, and we have to feel emotion, and kind of and using breath to breathe through anger, for example, breathe through it, and then there's a cognitive element here. Well, why is it anger? What is anger? For me, anger is a boundary defense. And there's unhealthy anger and healthy anger. Unhealthy anger is where I used to be explosive because I've repressed it, I'm not listening to it, and then all of a sudden, the straw that broke the camel back, it goes. But how are you express? Why are you angry? Go underneath that. What is it? What's truthful? There's some form of hurt underneath that.
And anger can be seen both as anger can be a manifestation of how you perceive your emotion, how you appraise your emotions, but it can also be if we're more, and I don't say this in a self-critical way, but it is helpful sometimes. Like, don't be, and again, in a coaching context, anger often comes from maybe something your athletes have done, or anger comes from something a colleague has made, a comment a colleague has made, and I always would, and I think to do this, don't do it all the time, and there's a dosage effect to this where you become you're too submissive at times towards maybe what aren't actually helpful outside influence. But I would always look further at my own session before I blame the athletes for misbehaving in it, for example. Like, I always would go, why did they not pay attention, and why was the session maybe not engaging enough? And I think that's helpful to do. But and similarly, I think like it can be a massively powerful emotion, being angry, and so far as like long-term energy. Like, if someone's done you wrong, like, that is also something that you can use that as a tool, and it's just about how you reposition it. I suppose it's not being captured by it, it's actually owning it. And it's like that's that state, that's that change, because in a very competitive space like coaching, and a very emotional space like sport, you need to get good at managing these things. If you think it's all about just only being happy all the time, it's like, that doesn't happen. That ain't realistic. So I see a lot of use to that. And then let's think then about having the meetings. What were you meaning by that then? Is this about, being goal directed in a way that you maybe are going to approach these meetings, not being, led off the cuff of the moment? What is that? What does having a pre-meeting mean?
I've heard so much about meetings throughout the day, and they're a waste of time, or they're people who come in, that they're bringing their stuff with them into the meeting, their judgments, their resentment, their anger, their frustrations, and it's and this self-preservation again in the meeting. So if you can prepare before that meeting, just to take a few minutes, breathing, getting a hold of your state, getting clarity on what message you want to get across, and being open to truly hear what people are saying, rather than trying to be, the lead into this. Are you trying to be effective? Are you trying to be right? And sometimes you might be right in what you know, but are you being affected by hammering that home?
Okay. And is that, so it's almost like, is that like carrying half a judgment as opposed to the full conclusion before you've heard all the evidence? Because sometimes that, you aren't always, like, I always think, like, if a coach is going to have a challenging conversation with an athlete and they need to respect, they probably don't know everything. It's better to sometimes have half a conclusion in mind, go and find out the rest. And in that challenging space, the athlete might be able to communicate it, and then it gives you, at least, if you don't agree with it still, you've at least heard their perspective. So you're treating them, and it's sort of like how you want to be treated is how you should treat others. So you're treating them as a person. They're probably more likely to then respect what comes out of it. You're able to maybe build a rationale for maybe why the course of action that you did believe initially is still the right way to go, but it's building in their perspective. And what we're doing here is reconnecting with people, aren't we? This is, again, it's and I suppose if we're trying to build a wider culture, this is that we need to be that stimulus for change across a group of people too. I think that is really, I mean, there's research around this. Valorant's done a lot of stuff in the space. So, no, not Valorant, McGew, in self-determination theory. It's called like autonomy supportive change orientated feedback. So there's that we can see the utility of that. The last thing I wanted to see and kind of touch on, because you mentioned about what perhaps helps you detach from it, and I wonder, is this all about almost because I want to go back to, you mentioned earlier in the conversation about how sometimes we think we take sports sometimes too seriously as well, and that can sometimes perhaps be a reason why we carry it with us home. Like I'm quite conscious of being quite deliberate in saying, and it's not in a deprecating way or not in a way that's to try and demean the profession, because I have so much to do with it and I'm so reliant on it as well. But like I just talk rubbish about coaching, and when I do a wee bit of coaching, it's just a bit of coaching to me. I don't do it, but I don't say that for a reason is to suggest that it's not an important activity that has a massive impact on people. But I know that if I carry the weight of it being an important activity with me, I can't manage myself as well. If I'm in that space, I'll have more anxiety when a session doesn't go correct. Whereas if it's just a bit of fun, it's just a bit about coaching, when things don't go correct, I'm more easy to manage it. And if things go well, great. I'm not also overly elevated. If things don't go so well, I'm more resilient to it. And again, this is how we can sort of redirect that. It's not, it sounds counterintuitive, but it isn't really. And I just wonder, does that sit with you at all? Or in terms of what are other strategies that you might also think about that helps us detach from our work at the end of the day in some space?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to make it personal, isn't it? If you gave the example if athletes they're not engaged in a session, it's so easy to take that personally. It's so
Mm,
easy to take that professionally. Oh, the session's not any good. I would also say, what's going on in their life? Why are they
mm,
distracted?
mm,
Especially kids,
mm,
but adults as well. Like they're like, we're all going. I've come to realize everyone is dealing with something.
mm,
Um, and then yeah, so how do we detach from work on that idea of that we're so the success of this individual sessions or the game of the week or whatever it is. So many take it personally and are on a downer
mm,
if they lose. But kind of again looking at the bigger picture, coming up higher, it's just one game is part of a whole season, and
mm,
what can be learned from those environments. And I think that's where we have to, I believe it has to be a conscious practice to have perspectives outside of sport and outside of our role. Like, yes, we want to bring everything to it and be our best, but we have so much uncontrollable stuff that
mm,
have nothing to do with us that can affect a result, for example.
mm.
You
So,
know,
but is this now a topic of identity then? Is it about broadening your identity?
I think so. Yeah, the same as athletes. Athletes do. I mean, another quote by a psychologist from the research was around something like this. Uh, we're focused at allowing athletes or empowering athletes to have different identities outside of their sport, but look around and show me staff members who are not being taken advantage of for their dedication and
Mm,
their identity. And I think again, it's just an individual check-in as a self-awareness reflection to look, what is this getting too sticky for me? Why is it getting too sticky for me?
mm,
uh, I hear so much coaches are too tired when they're getting from work. They don't go on dates, they don't see
mm,
friends, they're too tired, they're doing some data analysis when they get in at night because they haven't got time during the day because they've been doing all these different sessions. And I think it's crucial for us to be our best, to have that space outside. A
mm,
cliche example would be, you're on a plane, you do the routine safety check. You've got to put your mask on before you put on others. And I think that relates into,
mm,
we've got to look after ourselves on some level
mm,
to be able to give our best to the environment. And
mm,
if we're so attached, our identity is so I mean, I was a strength and conditioning coach. It
mm,
was who I was. At social events, people say, what do you do? Oh, I do this. Wow, you must be really good at what. It was this boost to my ego because it was
mm,
so brittle and I needed it,
mm,
and I think that doing that inner work around identity, reflecting on what ones serve you, what ones are limiting you, kind of, and really looking at yourself and your self-worth, and
mm,
coming back to the emotional work, that elevated emotions, by connecting to that. That's certainly a powerful way to begin to invoke some stability within. Because if we can feel,
mm,
you're saying what, because what is at the end of the result, what is at the end of the job, at the end of the winning season, at the end of the PhD, at the end of all these things we're striving for, all we're really, they're all great on their own, but what is it? It's a feeling.
mm,
It's a feeling. That's why we do all this stuff. The end result is a feeling, an emotion, is a chemical residue of an event. So if we can cultivate emotions within us of elevated feelings, it doesn't mean those things are bad, it doesn't. But if we're reliant on things outside of us to make us feel a certain way, we're stuck.
And is that perhaps, I think in the conversation identity, and just quite often, even in a helping way, when we talk about how we can create multiple identities, it's still attached to membership of a group. So what I think is quite important as well, like, it's not enough, I don't think, to tell coaches to see themselves also a brother, as a husband, or as a wife, or as a but I think it's also helped them to see themselves as kind, as thoughtful, as you know, and this is values. This is now starting to go into who the aim is of being, and then because again they aren't easily removed, and that's the issue, is where it's if your sense of self-worth is tied to membership of a group. Membership of a group is not permanent. That's a difficult, unless it is in some sense, obviously, you know, being a family member and something like that. You know, but there's so many things around that is also at prey by some circumstance, and can therefore can be a dangerous space to be in if you're in absolutely relying on it, because it negates who you are and what your value is there too. I just wonder as well, but this is another thing, because I think what you speak to a lot of the time, Richard, as well, about is boundaries. But it's not easy to detach from work, for example, if, and this is maybe one trick, I wonder if organisations can think differently, but most coaches are attached to WhatsApp groups for their club. And it's like, so you're sitting there on the couch at night, and and a lot of coaches won't feel comfortable about saying, actually, I won't be part of a WhatsApp group. And these are, but really, that, you know, these are artifacts as well that, you know, and what helps one person is an issue for another, and this is the aspect of the sticky part of this, is what do we do with that? Because this is the tough bit, isn't it? It's just, we can't get rid of the WhatsApp group, but we have to manage our time on it, and then it's like, how, you know, and it's tough. It's just a hard space. I don't think there's any answers we can give, but it's just questions that we can keep asking ourselves to keep reprioritising where our values are and and how we flex in that. Because I think there is a reality too, isn't there, where work-life balance is your work and your life aren't separate things, that as much as they can be, and we should at times see them as that, but there is a morphing of stuff that it's so blended into who we are in some degree that there's, in moderation, there's times we need to work like a Trojan, there's times we need to work less, and as long as we're spinning the plates at different times, I think that can maybe be more sustainable.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just on that example you gave, I think on that WhatsApp group, you know, I completely understand. And I think one way of doing it, say, look, I'm only going to check this group out of work hours at these times, and you have it on mute. You don't even have it on, or you have your work phone, and you just, okay, I'll check it between these times, and the rest of the time you leave it upside down so you don't see it. You turn it off. If anything is needed at 9 o'clock at night, I question that. So a coach, a physio I was working with, like, around, if there's a game at night, player gets injured, yes, they're going to go get a scan most likely, or probably if it's a night game, they'll probably get a scan the next day. So you could say, that, okay, if you're the person working that night, you're available on the phone, fine. The rest of the team don't need to know about that, because there's no progress in the injury, other than maybe there's an assessment, but nothing can be done until the next day. So again, just getting this on the table, like getting a system in place, like, okay, who's responsible for the game tonight? Me. Okay, right. Okay, it's on me, and I can sort this out. Well, let's find out tomorrow. It's only someone's anxiety. It's a coach's anxiety to want to know straight away, because, and coming back to that, losing a job, or like if their best player has got injured, okay, well, it's their anxiety. You can manage that. Nothing's going to change from 10 o'clock at night till 9 o'clock in the morning. Nothing.
Yeah, and you can delegate, I suppose, there too, isn't it? That's about just let the coach not be so concerned with being in control of everything either.
Right.
I know some people find it useful as well, don't they? Like, I mean, you can even use sort of like action words like shut down. It's time to shut down. Like the way you would shut down your laptop, it's time to shut down your mind. And I think coaches can also, it's only if we make these an everyday occurrence, it's a habit, it's going to become better with practice, isn't it, as well? So. No, Richard, no, I appreciate we've taken up a lot of your time. I can only thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us. I think, and if I can attempt to summarise some of the stuff we've spoke to, we've actually took a bit of a sort of philosophical route, I think, to start with, and understanding value systems, and then we've kind of moved from that to and I suppose understanding where there can be a harmonious relationship in the values we have and what we want for our life and with the club or organisation, but also one that isn't so much that, and we have to maybe at times as coaches be willing to address that and not explain it away. But we've also now moved on to some sort of takeaway, you can pick up and use habits, everyday occurrences, and if that's with a view of detachment, or it's with the view of helping prepare us for sessions, and not in a way that is negating a role, but actually helping a role as a coach, because we're now sort of seeing the synergy between health and well-being and performance. And if we put these things together, that is sustainable, and that is healthy, and that is importantly putting the coach at the front of their own priorities, because if you want to help other people, you need to help yourself. So unless you've got anything to add to that, Richard, I think we can leave it there today. Is there anything that you need to add to that, or do you think we've done okay there?
No, I think that's great. It's been,
so where could people, because one of the things that I really want to plug is you have a podcast, and I was listening to it just this morning, the Untapped Potential podcast, and that's on Spotify, your Apple Podcasts, everywhere you kind of listen to a podcast. And I would just, for those that are listening, I would really, really recommend giving it a listen. Really great stuff. Richard had different guests on, and comes at things from a self-care, perspective, Richard, and I think that is, we don't see a lot of that. It's unfortunately a niche area still within the sort of world of sports coaching and performance sport. And I just think it's a fantastic mission. Is there any ways that other people might contact you, Richard, if perhaps they're looking to maybe use your services, or just find out about some of the resources that you've made that are available to them?
Straight to the website, menbehindsport.com. And just for those female coaches listening, I purposely brought some amazing female coaches and practitioners onto the podcast. It's not Men Behind Sports, not because men have got it bad and women have got it easy. It's because, like we've touched on here in this conversation, I think I've got more to offer than the male lens. And I think Vicky Hoyton, for example, has got the Female Coaching Network, who's doing amazing work in the female space. And ultimately, I see the female male kind of beginning to become this one, the female voice becoming stronger in sport and more presence in sport, but two, that there's this working together, and that does happen on the ground. I do know that, so just to say that. Secondly, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. I'm less active on Twitter, but X, sorry, I'm less active on there. But Instagram, LinkedIn, and the website, and then Untapped Potential is where we can find them. And that Coach Toolbox is a free resource on the website. You'll see it, and just download it if you're interested in this idea of self-regulation and connecting to some thoughts and emotions that you do want to feel to bring your best self. Like you might find them interesting and useful.
Yeah, no, excellent, Richard. Thank you. Thanks so much again. And thanks for those that are listening. I hope you found this episode as helpful as I have, and I will see you next time.